Hello, my beautiful mythical old souls, and a huge warm welcome back. Could our long ago ancestors remind us of a more human, compassionate, effective, sane way of parenting? Well, in this week's episode, I'm joined once again by the wonderful Arthur Haines. Arthur is a Maine hunting, fishing, and recreation guide, forager, ancestral skills mentor, author, public speaker, and botanical researcher. Arthur is also a devoted father, and today we explore something very close to both of our hearts: how we parent and how we might remember a truer way. Together, we explore whether our attempts to control and shape our children are not only unnecessary, but could be a wound to their sovereignty. This is a deeply human conversation rooted in both lived experience and ancestral wisdom, where we ask what it means to parent in a way that honors the innate wholeness of the child. We journey through the emotional and practical terrain of ancestral child rearing, from physical punishment and coercive control to co sleeping, mixed age play, and the essential power of physical touch. We reflect on how so many of our cultural norms, even the well intentioned ones, can fracture the nervous system of both parent and child. And we remember together that there is another way, one that's more natural, connected, and compassionate, a way that calls us back to what we already know, somewhere deep within. And if you recognize that the way you look holds pain, has you hide or contort, you may well be experiencing what I call the beauty wound. And in just under a week, on the 13th of May, I and a circle of women will be journeying deep into that beauty wound to alchemize it into our own unique beauty potion, becoming that mythic beauty that is truly right for our soul. We only have one place left. And again, there's not long before we begin. If you feel that place is for you, come join me at bemythical.com/beauty. And if you're struggling with the challenges of walking your soul path in this crazy modern world, come join our Academy of the Soul Unio. You can find out more by hopping on over to bemythical.com/unio or click the link in the description. And now back to this week's episode. Let's dive in. Hello, Arthur. Welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me back again.
Oh, obviously can't get enough of you. And we actually, I think, sort of agreed to come back and do this one at the beginning of our last episode. I was just recalling how, as we began, your daughter was near you in the room. And I witnessed how you spoke to her as you were asking her if you could have the space to yourself and the quiet so that we could record. And as I was witnessing that, I was really struck in a really positive, beautiful way at the way that dynamic unfolded and the respect and love and choice that was present in it. And when you came back, I said to you how I'd loved witnessing that, and then we had a sort of short conversation about the kind of choice and sovereignty and treating children as actual human beings with choices, and which of course isn't something that's novel to me, but there's always something precious in me witnessing another parent behave in that way with their children, and there was something particularly moving in the way that you did that. And so it seemed like, oh, of course, this is an episode actually that would be lovely to come back and do together. So here we are. And then we actually had a little kind of mini scene again at the start of this one, which I won't go into right now. But I was just like, yeah, perfectly apt and really setting the scene for us to have a really embodied conversation on this topic. So I'm really looking forward to this.
Same. This is a particular topic that I really love sharing information on. So I'll thank you here and then again at the end of the show for giving me the opportunity, because it's very sad to me, the parent-child interactions that I see around in the United States. I just see
Mm.
children's sovereignty ripped away from them over and over and over again throughout the day as I'm watching parents. But I'm also watching parents who are just burning themselves out by trying to control everything their child does. Don't run there. Don't pick that up. Don't throw this. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. And by the end of the day, they are so frazzled. They are just so beaten down from trying to control every aspect of this little human's life that now they're losing their patience and they can't be good people to really anybody. And I feel like
Mm.
people really need to understand that we have lived in this hunter gatherer communal type of setting where we were egalitarian, we were non hierarchical, and that includes the very young and the very old. And just because they're in our care, it doesn't mean that we have rights and privileges over them. And this
Mm.
whole idea that children are sovereign, that they're sovereign humans, and I need to respond to them in many situations the exact same way that I might respond to you. And if it's not appropriate for me to speak to you in a particular way, then why is it appropriate to me to speak to a child? And here, we're weird. We're Western, industrialized, and we're educated. We're rich. We're democratic. We've got all of that thing going on, and we forget that as weird societies, that we are very different from not only most of the societies around the planet, but also particularly back into time. And we love to normalize what we do now, but the fact is what we do now in in these heavily industrialized societies is actually really weird. And I'm not trying to use the acronym. I'm just saying it's very bizarre biologically and evolutionarily. And so this is a topic I really love speaking on because it helps both parents and children.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm already like, I can't, I'm already so thrilled we're having this conversation. Can we just start with a little bit of your backstory when it comes to parenting in particular? So, you would have shared a little bit of that in our previous episodes, but for someone who perhaps just wants to understand it
Mhm.
specifically from the context of parenting, or this is the first episode they've seen between us, would you be able
Right.
to put a bit of flesh on the bones? Like, how did you come to see ultimately children in this way and therefore parenting in this way?
Right. Um, I first started as sort of a botanist. I work as a plant taxonomist, but I also sort of dabble in ethnobotany. So I study human interactions with plants. And when I started looking into hunter gatherer diets and noticing that the nutrient density of their diets was substantially more than what we get in our cultivated and sort of animal husbandry diets that we have in industrialized countries, and then I started investigating, well, if their diet was so protective of chronic disease, what about the other aspects of their life? Were those also beneficial to them? And you start looking at, their sleep patterns and their lack of insomnia because they've had bright light and blue light, the whole spectrum of light due to their elemental exposure during the day, and then dark abodes at night that don't have lights and flashes and Wi-Fi. And you see where hopefully I'm trying to go. Their movement patterns, literally the way they seated themselves didn't lead to problems that we get with chronic sitting in chairs and a shortening of our connective tissue that leads to back problems or potentially leads to back problems. Um, you know, they're just everything that I research in these wild populations seems to sort of demonstrate a benefit to adopting what aspects of the life we can and pulling that into our modern day living. And I just found it everywhere. And so, I mean, I want to be clear. I was raised in a house that used physical punishment. My grandfather, whom I love very much, but would often joke with me, children should be seen but not heard. In other words, we were not necessarily allowed to speak out of turn. And, all of the hierarchy was there. And growing up, I always said, if I had kids, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this. And to the great fortune of my children, I did not have them until much later in life when I had learned how damaging all of those parenting practices are. And it really all boils down to that there is no sovereignty for the young. We've stripped it away. They do not have the rights and privileges of adult humans. And this is just the honest truth of it all. And there are even homes where the family dog has been trained with positive reinforcement, is never yelled at, is never struck, is never grounded. There's no negative, but the children won't even get the treatment that the family dog does. And it's just, again, another hard truth about the parenting, and keeping in mind that here in the United States, the last time I looked at this statistic, 70% of parents were accepting of physical punishment. That doesn't mean they always used it, but just to give an idea. And this sort of leads us into one of the very first differences between hunter gatherers and weird parents. Again, using the acronym
Mhm.
for our industrialized members here. Physical punishment was just simply not something that was used, and there has been some really great writing, particularly on the Inuit, like the book Never in Anger, actually discussing like their version of parenting and how up until the age of around 3 or so, young children, toddlers at this point who were acting out were simply never spoken to in anger. It was just understood we don't even have a developed brain yet. We often think of these people as so primitive, but yet they absolutely understood that this is a person who's developing their central nervous system. They're developing that executive function to keep themselves calm and to not throw tantrums at a young age. So not only was there no yelling and screaming at children and punishment, but certainly there was no physical punishment. There was no striking of the children. And I like to describe it like this, and to think about, I am allowed to do something to my 5-year-old daughter that if I were to do it to you, I could be arrested for assault. Right? The exact same action. If I were to restrain you and strike you, you could have me arrested. How on earth am I allowed to do it to this tiny little person?
Yeah, I
How?
was I can't quite remember what the law is. I think over there it's still legal, and I think in this country I think it's slightly different with, say, Scotland,
Mhm.
England. And I was having a conversation with my daughter about it not long ago, about how I think there was some kind of movement to kind of make the laws in each of these kind of countries that make up the UK the same, something like that. And so
Mhm.
my daughter and I were in conversation and did a bit of research, and a line of it said something like, I think it is probably better than it is over in the States. Like, I think it's illegal to a point. And it was like, but it was something like, as long as it doesn't leave a mark. And it was so, I mean, I remember seeing, as I read it, I remember seeing my daughter's face looking at me like, it's just like unimaginable that it's okay up until that point. And it's like we've never done anything like that and wouldn't. But I think it really shows you when you have someone that's kind of innocent to all of this and see the reaction and
Mhm.
the right reaction to have. It really was one of those moments of like, yes, that's what everyone's missing. Like how a child would like think there's children out there that are being hit and it's okay as long as it doesn't leave a mark. How could that be okay?
And it speaks to, again, the lack of sovereignty and the fact that we live in a hierarchical society now. I remember when my oldest daughter was young. She may have been 4 or 5 years old, and I mentioned to her that there are children that when they're punished, they are struck by their parents, and she started laughing. I was like, wow, that's a unusual reaction. And then finally I understood what it was. She said, I know you're joking. And it took two other adults in the house to explain to her that, like, no, that's what happens, like in lots of places, before she
Oh,
understood, like, oh, really? Because obviously, while one of the really important caveats that we have to present here is no one is expected to be an angel. We're all isolated. So many of us are living in our, nuclear families. No one's perfect. We lose our tempers, and we shouldn't beat ourselves up over this for days and days and days on end. Like, I'm not perfect, but I aspire for the things that we are talking about today. And I mostly meet them, but I'm not perfect. And so for parents that are out there, especially single moms, which we get here, a lot right now. Sometimes we're going to raise our voice, and we
Mm,
don't have to look at it as this giant failure. Just apologize. The exact same thing that you
yeah.
would do to an adult if you raised your voice. Just treat them as if they were another adult. Um, and I think it's really important for me to think, when I think about physical punishment, I think about anything where the line is blurry between acceptable behavior and illegal behavior. Maybe we should just not do it at all. And keeping in
Mm,
mind that physical punishment does rob children of IQ points. This has been demonstrated in studies that homes where children are struck as a physical punishment, with when all things are isolated for in large statistical studies, they come out lower on the IQ scale, just a small bit, but it is a measurable difference than homes where they're shown a bit of respect and their sovereignty is, actually afforded to them.
mm, yeah. Can I ask, just out of curiosity, the
Mhm.
ages of your children?
Oh, my oldest is 11. That's Samara, and my youngest, Farah, is now 5. I was 43 with my first and 49 with my second, and who knows? Maybe there'll be another one. I don't feel like I'm I'm done. But the point being, it was really important for me to wait until later in life. As a young male, as we've talked about, with virtually no real masculine models, I was as
Mm,
selfish and callous as, every other young man out there. There was nothing special about me in terms of wanting to live up to some archetype of masculinity, and be that type of parent that would give my children sovereignty. I mean, just there are so many ways to think about sovereignty with children, which is, again, this whole overarching goal that's going to be going on throughout, our discussion today. If you picked up something that I didn't want you to pick up, you were visiting my home and you picked up something, I would never just walk over to you and tear it out of your hand. I would ask you for it, right? Or
mm,
mention something like, "Oh, that's something very special. Would you mind?" You understand where I'm going with this. But we
mm,
just have no qualms about walking up to children and just, "Oh, nope, I don't want you to have that." And what have they learned? And this is really important with this type of thing, or even physical punishment. Remember what the definition of bullying is, right? Bullying is a larger, or at least in some way physically or emotionally intimidating person who uses the threat or actual violence to coerce somebody into doing something. So
mm,
physical punishment is fully bullying children. And then they
mm.
go to school and mimic the behavior on smaller children, and they get in trouble for it. The very thing
Yeah.
that's role
Gosh.
modeled in their
Mm,
home.
mm,
So, when we encounter those situations where a child picks up something that, maybe a guest in the house would rather not have them playing with, and I need to get it back quickly, I offer trades. I know things that they like and would love to play with that maybe they haven't had access to, that is safe for them. You know what I'm trying to get at. And I offer trades, as opposed to, excuse me, just going up and sort of tearing things from their
mm,
hand. That just, it role models, because that's how they're learning, is through role modeling. You're just role modeling. The bigger you are, the more you can get away with. And that's not, is that the
mm.
type of empathy and compassion
Is
that we
that the
want to be role
message? Yeah.
modeling, right?
Mm. I mean, it's funny because when we started here, I was like, well, I imagine the vast majority of people listening to this show would be kind of like nodding, I imagine most of them would be violently in agreement, ironically, with what we're talking about here. But I think it was a really good place to start, because there's so many sort of subtleties that are downstream from
Mhm.
this idea of using physical punishment, that I'm really glad that we started with this, because there are things that you can just be like, well, of course I'd never do that. But there's sort of like subtle ways that we can do this that I really only illuminated through this kind of conversation. So thank you for starting here.
Yeah, and you're most welcome. And I think what happens is people make this case that I physically punish my children because I love them. Like, can now let me switch that around and say I beat my wife because I love her. And no one would accept this. They'd be like,
Mm,
no, you're an abusive scumbag. They would just harbor no goodwill toward me. But if I strike my child because maybe they went into the road, somehow now it's okay. And it isn't. What I've tried to do, and one of the best examples that I can think of, is some people, they don't want, we have a wood stove here, and they certainly don't want their child to be burned by putting their hands on the wood stove or falling against it and that kind of thing. And, but just punishing your child if they go near it, they have no understanding of what's going on, except for some reason when they get near this object, they're in trouble. They haven't actually learned the lesson. So, what I did with my daughter, both daughters, is I waited for a time when the wood stove was hot, but not injurious. It was not so burning hot that they could
mm,
physically touch it. And I allowed them to make contact with it. And whether you, doesn't matter what language you're using, we were using the word kasipede, which is the indigenous word for this part of the world that means it is hot. And so they now understood,
mm,
oh, kasipede means it's, but if you were using English or whatever language, you could say it's very hot, it's hot, don't touch it. And suddenly there's a wide-eyed learning moment where they're like, they touch it and they bring their hand back, and now they understand that anytime they hear it's hot or whatever language you're speaking in, it's like, that is something I need to stay away from. I'm telling you, it was
mm,
vastly more effective than punishment. And it didn't break the trust between the caregiver and the child, which is what physical punishment does.
mm. Yeah. So I know you had, I think it was 7 points that you wanted to
Yes.
us to
And
explore. Should we move on to
and
the second?
we've covered the physical punishment, which is a really big one. This idea that we're not going to act
Mm,
in anger, because when we lose our control as parents and we strike our children, that's not punishment, that's abuse. You lost control. Stop
mm,
pretending that you're doing something beneficial for them. Another one that's really important that we see amongst hunter gatherers around the world is this high responsibility given to the toddler and to the child. Remember, they're sovereign beings. They are allowed to explore their world. And people will say, well, yeah, but we live in a different world and it's really dangerous now. Trust me, it isn't more dangerous. In some ways, it's much less
mm,
dangerous because they had landscapes with large predators, right? They
mm,
had toxic plants to contend with. They had all kinds of hazards, including fires that would be going for cooking and staying warm. Many hunter gatherer children that were observed by anthropologists could be seen with small burn scars where they had fallen into a fire. But it was considered very bad taste to drag your child away from the fire, because if the adult wanted to play next to it, you would let them. It's up to the child because it's their physical body. Now, I'm not saying that we have to take this to the full extent that potentially hunter gatherers do, but allowing that child to have more responsibility for themselves allows them to develop a confidence to understand what their physical limitations are, that when we're totally controlling them, they never get a chance to really understand that. I
mm,
mean, there's a funny story. There's an indigenous group on the African continent where there's an anthropologist who is interviewing a mom, and she has an infant behind her. And the infant's playing with a machete. And the infant drops the machete, And the mom, while she's speaking to the anthropologist, just sort of reaches around behind her and picks the machete up and hands it back to the child. And the anthropologist coming from, one of our an industrialized country is sort of like this, and the mom is not even responding. Just like, here you go, have it back, because it's the child's will. It's their choice. It's their body. And people listening to this are going to have a really hard time, potentially with this. When we're up on top of a cliff, I try to do my best with this type of stuff. And as my young toddler
Mm.
daughter gets closer, I move closer to her, but I don't necessarily intervene, if that makes sense. I'm doing what I need to do so I can feel sane in that moment and make sure that I feel like I'm protecting her, but I don't pull her back. I'm just right there for the grab. So she still feels like
Yeah.
she has her autonomy, and I feel like I'm letting her still explore her environment. There are ways
Gosh.
to accomplish this.
Yeah, that brings up I think there's something important to recognize in this, that it's really going to bring up our own stuff, which we then need to be in relationship to.
Yes,
This
right.
isn't necessarily easy. It's going to bring up all of our own, understandable kind of like protection towards our child, but also depending on our upbringing, the circles we move in, like worry of other people judging us. And there's a lot there that we'll need to be in relationship to in order to kind of move
Yes.
towards what you're describing. Mm.
You can't eliminate risk. And, we tend to be a society that wants everything to be extremely safe. And I would just argue, what kind of existence, if we follow that idea of safety to its logical conclusion, we wouldn't play sports because we might break something or sprain something. We'd never go outside because a branch might fall on us or scratch our eye.
Mm.
You understand where I'm going. If we follow this too far, we just end up with a life in a padded room. Let your children explore their world and back off with the helicopter parenting, because it's bad for them and it's bad for you. Um, another sort of moving on to these things that have been observed in hunter gatherer groups sort of around the world, in the far north, the equator, different continents, is this idea of mixed age playgroups. Now, when we send our children
Mm.
off to public school, that is usually not the case. We group them together by similar age and put them in classrooms because we want the curriculum to match their level of brain development and the prerequisite, education that they've had so far. But it leads to problems. We used to have in small, communal settings, these groups where there would be children of all different ages. The older children were looking after the younger children and became very experienced caregivers who could now help
Mm.
the actual parents, and were watching other parents' children as well. So there was just this beautiful communal caregiving, if you will. And it's been observed that children, even as young as 4 years old, were watching after toddlers. They were already learning how to keep them safe in the terrain that they were in. But of course, there's another problem with this that people don't think about. Let's just call it a biological seniority. It's not a hierarchy, but clearly, if I'm 5 and that person's 13, I know they know more than me. They have greater physical abilities than me. They can assist me with things. And there is how about I call it submission, which is much too strong a word, but I'm going to submit to we shouldn't do that because of this. And like, okay, I trust this
Mm.
person and they know more than me. When you're all at the same age, you're all fighting for dominance. It's yet another
Mm.
thing that reinforces hierarchy. Oh, that kid has aged or grown a little faster than this kid, so they have a slightly larger body that they can use to get their way. Or who knows the most, who can, just expel the most facts, because as young kids, you don't have many experiences. All of this just leads to the development of hierarchies. And so we're supposed to be in these
Mm,
multi-age play groups. And it's
yeah.
actually harmful for socialization to be in a single age play group. You are not able to watch your role models who maybe can even just speak the language better than you. You're stuck mostly with
Mm,
children, if you're, say, 5 years old, who are all, they don't know how to conjugate their verbs properly and so on. And it's just getting reinforced by the people that they're around. Language is just one easy topic that we could come up with. But that's with everything in life. If you're around people of your own age all the time, you're not learning from the older children who know how to do things at a higher competency than you do.
mm. Gosh, the that makes so much sense. And with each one of the observations you've shared so far, it's it's like this increasing picture of just fundamentally, systemically, we're just building everything just completely upside down and inside out. And it's like, it's hard because, yeah, it's like everything we look at is built in the wrong way to support what you're describing.
It is, and it's really hard to completely step out of that and not be
Mm,
considered weirdos living up on the mountain that no one wants to be around, because we still want to have our circle of friends, our circle of family. We still need to interact with people who live in town, so to speak, because there's lots of good people in all of these settings.
mm,
So we can only break down so much of it. So sometimes we have to figure out what we can adjust and what we have the capability and willingness to make adjustments to and move on those things for the benefit of the coming generations.
mm,
Speaking about the mixed age playgroups, there's a couple other things here. Almost zero formal instruction, which is primarily all we do. We send them off to public
mm,
school and they
yes.
sit and they listen to a
Hmm.
teacher, right?
Hmm.
And little to no direct instruction. In other words, I'm not going to tell you how to do it. While I'm working on something, you're watching what I do, and then you go off and try to replicate it. And at first, you
Hmm.
fail. But as you get older, you've watched it now 15 times, your dexterity, your physical strength increases, and you're starting to get it. And eventually, by the time that you're approaching that adulthood, you've got these skills down pat solely through replicating them by watching. And as somebody who has taught physical activities like mountaineering and submission wrestling for a long time, I can tell you that the ability to watch and replicate is almost gone from our population. They're waiting
Mm,
for okay, everybody pay attention. Now class has started. Now pay attention. And I'm going to verbally tell you how to do it. Because if I just show you, your your ability to learn through watching and replicating has been essentially stripped away from you. It's how you were evolutionarily designed to learn, but through formal education and sitting in a classroom and being told, okay, now's the moment to pay attention because I'm speaking, we've just, all those teachable moments get missed because no one's paying attention to them. If that makes sense.
mm. It really does. I had tons of. It makes complete sense, and I had loads of different um, examples, both to the contrary and also um, matching what you were saying. Because I was thinking, it's funny because our evolutionary heritage, I think, is still present in that. I was thinking, if we, with some things, I think we would naturally kind of go into that. Like, say, for example, teaching a child to cook. I think most people would be more inclined to, just be cooking and the child watch and maybe sort of get involved now and again. And then there's sort of these other whole areas where we don't. And I was thinking, I wonder why that is. I wonder why there's some areas where that still um, is present, and then others there isn't. But you're completely right. It makes everything you've said makes so much sense. And it's also, as adults, unless we consciously unlearn that way we've been taught to learn.
Right,
we're
right.
we're there kind of waiting, like we continue that on, don't we, where we lose that ability to learn through watching and absorbing what's happening, as opposed to sort of sitting there being spoon fed.
Let me give an example between my two daughters. None of this is the fault of either of my daughters, because I'm also continuing to learn. When my first daughter was born, Samara, and she became a toddler, she wasn't often included in doing things. That included like chores in the home, doing dishes and cooking and things like that. And that's, many parents understandably, they only have so much energy, again, because they're isolated from all of the communal caregivers that they
Mm,
would have had historically. And it's so hard to, oh, now I've got to like pick up their mess, and I've got to clean up the dinner mess. And but the problem is, it robs children of their desire to be involved, and then they
mm,
stop helping. My 5-year-old daughter, from the moment she was born, she has been included in everything. She has been helping us butcher animals since she could physically hold a knife in her hand. So by 1.5, she kind of knew how to use a blade without too much risk of hurting yourself. Both of my daughters have made little tiny cuts on their hands before, and let's not pretend that adults don't do this. I do this all the time. I'll nick
mhm.
myself, but they've had nothing serious because they've had knives in their hands since they were very young. But because my younger daughter was always included, and if it was something that she couldn't be included in, we literally set up a mock scenario so that she could still do essentially what we were doing. And that makes more work. But
Wow.
now you have one person who's
Mm,
always, I want to help, and another person, the older daughter, again, no fault of her own, who simply doesn't even always see what's happening because she was not
mm,
included from the beginning. So she's playing or doing things over here instead of being like, oh, wait, you're doing something. I want to be involved in it. And so
mm,
this whole idea of keeping them included so they can be watching you and learning is really important, because later on you build your house, your home, little helpers who want to
mm,
help you do dishes and want to help you peel things and sort things. At first it takes more time, but later on you gain a highly competent helper. And this is one of those things
mm,
that goes back to allow them to observe, even when it's going to take more energy to clean up the mess they've made as well. It's part of this
yeah.
no formal education and little or no direct instruction.
Mm. Oh, I love all of the examples you've just given. Yeah, makes complete sense. Where are we on our list of observations now?
Well, we've just got a couple more. Okay, that a couple more that I was hoping
Okay.
to be able to cover today during our discussion. So another one that's really important is high indulgence of the infant. This is the anthropological term for don't let them cry. Okay.
Mm,
When a child is crying, they're stressed and they're looking to be comforted. And we have all kinds of scenarios now where we have cry it out training and Ferber methods and so on, where we allow children to cry for extended periods of time. In hunter gatherer societies, this is not observed. Infants and toddlers are responded to promptly and always. Generally, within 10 seconds, the figure is they are they are immediately picked up and comforted. We have been convinced that if we coddle our children, I'm not talking about like a teenager, I'm talking about like an infant that can barely sit up at this point, that somehow if we respond to their crying, that we will create um, this person who will not have any strength and any resilience, that somehow we will break all that and create this very fragile person. We're dealing with humans at their most fragile stage. And hopefully, all I have to say is the cry it out method which is again not observed in any hunter gatherer population, was developed by a male pediatrician. Do I have to say any more?
Mm.
Like, what type of indoctrination does it take for a mammalian mother to not respond to the cries of her infant? But unfortunately, that is exactly what we've done. And when the
It's
children
everything you said
finally,
there.
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So I was about to say it's I didn't actually know that you said about a male pediatrician, but it makes a lot of sense. And I was just recalling when my first was a baby, it was just so I didn't even kind of get to the point of even kind of considering letting him cry. It was just so obvious it would be like unthinkable. It just has such a that sound of your baby crying, or any baby crying actually, it's just there is such an instinctive response to go to them. And I remember when I had friends with babies a similar age, and maybe when they're about sort of 6 months, and you're kind of like, hardly any sleep, and then you start to get well-meaning advice from people, where they're
Yes.
getting. I mean, no one really said this to me, but my friends were getting that kind of advice from family. We'll let them cry it out, and blah blah blah. And I remember one of my friends trying that and sharing with me what it felt like to her to try and sit and listen
Mm,
to her son cry in the other room and not go to him. And I remember just witnessing the whole thing, her sharing that and realizing like this isn't easy. It's not like she's thinking, oh, this is a great idea, but it was costing her so much to follow something that was so against her own instincts. It was a
right.
really, I mean, that was years ago, but it's so ingrained in my, like, not just my memory, like my embodied sense of like, oh my gosh, I could feel what that was costing her, and yet she
Yeah.
was doing it because this indoctrination.
It's really hard because, obviously we've raised our daughters with this. We respond to them when they've cried, particularly in infanthood and as toddlers. And certainly, I'm not saying that as an older child that, we don't sometimes see a child who might be, kind of putting on a little bit of a show. That's not what I'm discussing here. I'm talking about little humans who only have
Mm.
one way of communicating when they're in trouble, and that is to cry. And it's so hard because we'll be at our families' homes and they're putting their children to bed, often much too early. Their children aren't tired, but they're convinced that they need to have this. They go to bed at this time no matter what. And they're watching their children cry and listening to them through the infant monitor. Farah, who's still just up with us, she's just going to stay awake longer so that when I put her to bed, she's actually tired and she just goes to sleep. And because she goes to bed later, she just immediately falls asleep and doesn't wake up until much later in the morning. So there's no like 5 a.m. wake up because they went to bed so darn early kind of thing. And she's just watching and listening to her nieces and nephews crying on and on and on, sometimes for an hour and a half before they finally fall asleep.
Oh my
And
gosh.
it's so awkward. Like, here's Farah,
Mm.
who's not experiencing any of that, and they're sort of looking at her, and then they're looking at their own children, and it makes for such an awkward moment, and I feel so terrible for those children. I understand that parents need time alone as well. um, But this is a really harmful practice because by the time your children stop crying, there are cases where they've gone into kind of a shutdown mode. Try to imagine an infant in the wild. I'm talking about a wild animal that's been left. It calls for its parents. It calls for its parents. At some point, a predator is going to find this calling infant, and the infant needs to essentially stop calling and be very quiet and not do anything vocal so it's not found. And this is sort of this instinctual behavior that eventually some children go into where they stop crying. And we are like, oh, see, it's working. The cortisol levels are still screaming. They're still
Oh.
stressed out of their gourd. They're
Mm.
just stopped crying because at some point in an evolutionary perspective, the lion, the hyena, whatever it is going to find the squeals, the cries,
Mm.
the vocalizations of whatever infant species we're talking about. So that none of this is good for the child. And when we look at hunter gatherers, there's always this close physical contact, which is one of our last ones here to talk about. There's co sleeping. I was warned never to sleep with my child. The crib industry has done a wonderful job of terrifying us from co sleeping.
Mm.
Um, for moms that need sleep, this is one of the best ways. Your daughter, your son starts to cry, mom rolls over, starts breastfeeding, they go to sleep. You don't have to get up and walk into another room, breastfeed or bottle feed for a while, and then go back to bed. You are so darn awake at that point that it's totally disrupting your sleep patterns. So we always slept in the same bed with our children for quite some time. Age 4, 5, anyways, until they were ready to sleep on their own. Um, and that felt good to be able to provide that feeling of safety and security and protection for them that made them just much more secure about sleeping in another room eventually. And of course, this close physical contact, there's a really great statistic to share with you. When anthropologists watched various hunter-gatherer groups, how they interacted with their children, 80% of the interactions were nonverbal. So their physical touch primarily in some way, and only 20%
Mm.
were verbal. When they
Wow.
came to the United States to sort of get a comparison of what weird countries are doing, they found that it was the inverse. That 80% of our interactions were
Ah.
verbal and only
Wow.
20% were physical. We are literally disconnecting ourselves from that physical contact that
Mm.
infants would have experienced. Partly because there are times when moms and dads simply can't keep up when they're doing it alone. Again, remember, in a communal
Yes.
situation, baby could be handed around. So this isn't meant to be entirely judgmental, but it's also, know this, that your child is looking for lots of physical contact, and find ways to manifest as much of it as you possibly can.
Yeah. Oh, it's I feel a bit heartbroken at this point. It's
Yeah.
it, I
Well,
was just thinking back again to when my son was a baby, and again it was, whilst I, it was so obvious that co-sleeping was the thing to do. Again, just instinctively, I couldn't not, and yet the kind of, around you, it was, we call these constant messages being told, this is
yeah,
harmful, and this, all these reasons. And I look back and I just think, my goodness, I'm so glad I had just such a strong instinctual sense of what to do. um but and I was thinking also, I wonder, and it's hard to know because it's not like I have a comparison. My children are now 16 and 14, and very, like, physically affectionate. Like, I know my son
mhm,
being 16, a lot of my friends' children the same age, particularly boys, don't want that now. Whereas he'll quite happily say, like, "Oh, give me a cuddle," and kind of like literally snuggle up to him, literally put my arm around him to give him a hug. Um, and I wonder, it's only really occurred to me as we're in this conversation, I wonder if that is because we had so much physical closeness when they were young. It
yes.
is, it's just part of our language, part of our relationship. And it's only really occurred to me as we're talking now that maybe that is why.
Yeah, you normalized physical contact as opposed to trying to
Mm.
break it from a very early age, which I'm not saying that that's what the parents are trying to do, but it is a
No.
consequence of the
Mm.
parenting information that they're receiving. Look, we know this stuff is really important, all of these things and much more that we could talk about, because when we look at, let's look at our teenagers, say here in the United States, identity crises, freakouts. Like these are really common things. Like even things that are much more serious, like suicide. 1 in 6 high
Mm.
school students in the United States are having suicidal thoughts, and 1 in 12 make an attempt on their life.
Oh my
These are
gosh.
straight from the Centers of Disease Control, the CDC statistics, and you can find them online to confirm what I'm giving you. And there might be higher now because when I did a quick look, I noticed that they're increasing here in the United States. But that was not observed in hunter gatherer cultures. There was no teen suicide, and they knew exactly who they were and what their role was within their community. So identity crises simply didn't exist. These
Mm,
emotional mood swings are just unobserved. So we know that this parenting method is sort of what we're evolutionarily expecting to receive as an infant, but we don't receive
mm,
it. So maybe I'll leave you with just one last scenario that I think speaks to what happens when we really change up the communal living, the type of child rearing that we're doing, the physical punishment comes online. There are there are these two groups of people that are genetically similar in the Central Republic, excuse me, of Africa. In that country, there is a hunter-gatherer group and a group of farmers, agriculturalists that essentially split off from them, and they're living in these two different ways, but they are genetically similar. They have a common ancestor, so it makes for a
mm,
really great comparison.
mm,
One still living as hunter gatherers, the other living as agriculturalists. And they started asking, they asked children about their experiences of death and started recording who they could remember and a number of questions that I'll present to you here. And so the first thing they did is they asked hunter gatherer and agricultural children to write down all of the people that they could remember that had died, particularly adults. And what was interesting is that the hunter gatherer children could remember a similar number of male and female people who had died. The
mm,
agricultural children remembered more men than females that had died. Okay, not because
mm.
more men had died, just they remembered the men more than the females. Okay, it gets worse. So the level of grief experienced by the hunter gatherer children was the same depending on whether it was a female or a male. It didn't matter. They experienced a similar level of grief. The agricultural children experienced more grief when men died than they did when women died. Okay,
Mm.
like I said, it keeps getting worse. Now, in terms of biological kin, the hunter gatherers could remember approximately as many people on their mom's side that had died and on the father's side, whereas the agricultural children remembered more deaths on the father's side than they did on the mother's side. Okay? The grief that the hunter gatherer children experienced was tied to the relationship and the experiences they had had with them. In the agricultural children, the grief they experienced was tied to what they had received, the provisioning, the material gifts, and
Mm.
so on. Okay? And then how they coped. The hunter gatherer children spent time with family. The agricultural children wanted to receive material gifts to help them cope. Okay? So
Gosh.
this is a study. It can be looked up. It's quite crazy and it's quite stark. And this is what happens when we abandon our communal living, when we abandon the the parenting and the child rearing, and also when we abandon the celebration of both the masculine and the feminine. This is
Mm.
the results of that come from this pretty incredible study that was done. And I think anyone who's listening can understand that the hunter gatherer side of it demonstrates a much more balanced and emotionally mature person in many ways than what was witnessed in the children of agriculturalists. And so it's a call to the need to reestablish some of these biologically normal methods of interacting with children and with the other adults that were around.
Mm. Gosh, that is there's so much in there. Right. You
And scary.
can you unbreak my heart now at this point before we close, Arthur? Please leave us with some kind of message of hope.
Well, the problem is that if you're someone who's compassionate and you care about children, I can't. And you can't control what happens to other people's children. They have their rights. And you know it's wrong when people are like, that's my child and I'll do what I want. It's not your child. You're now placing ownership over them, right? It's not your child. It's the child that's in your care. And you have legal responsibility and financial responsibility, but it's not yours to control. If you if you view your child that way, you have already robbed them of their sovereignty.
Mm.
And so that's part of the problem is the very worldview, that we have. But I'm hoping that the things that you gave your children can in part help mend the heart what you're experiencing right now from just listening to what goes on in industrialized societies, because it sounds like you gave your children something a lot better than many children end up receiving, unfortunately.
Yes, and again, I think so much of that I was raised in quite an unusual way myself, and then I think a combination of that and I say sort of instincts just kind of like kicking in as they're meant to when we give birth. I look back and I feel fortunate really that I was blessed. It wasn't that um I didn't have it kind of figured out. It was just, in many ways, I feel I was kind of graced with what I needed at the time. And like you, I learned as well and, made mistakes. But I think in the main, I look back and I think, firstly, I feel very fortunate that I was able to parent in the way and continue to parent in the way we have. The other thing that I didn't have much of then, and the reason I'm about to say this now is I think when you're parenting very differently to what is the norm out there,
Mm-hmm.
you can question yourself and think like, what if this, basically, even though this is how we've parented for most of human history, it feels like I'm doing some crazy experiment here because no one else is doing this. And there isn't
Right.
really anyone else I can look to if you're not in that kind of community. And I can say, it's not like my children are grown ups, but say my son's 16, and so far the crazy experiment seems to be paying off. And I wish I'd had more parents of older children being able to tell me that then. And so I'm kind of like passing it on now. So far, the experiment seems to be working out beautifully.
Yeah, and that's sort of crazy to think that when we try to go back and do our best to mimic our evolutionary norms, and it is sort of a fuzzy target, right? We don't know exactly because we
Mm,
weren't there living with indigenous people, but we've got anthropological reports that we can take information from. We're shooting for this fuzzy goal, and now it's an experiment to sort of regain our ancestral roots. And
mm,
in fact, it will get looks and it will get criticisms and judgment, unfortunately, from people who are doing very harmful things sometimes, but just not realizing it. And I encourage people to go back to, if your child is sovereign, the way you will interact with them will change. And, I get criticism. It's like, oh, you do that sovereign thing, your child gets to do anything they want. And that is absolutely false, because an adult that comes into my house doesn't get to do anything they want, right? They can't break things. They can't put themselves at risk of serious mortal harm. They can't put others at risk of serious injury and harm. I would intervene in those cases, like I think any compassionate person would, and I would do the same for my child. But so long as we're outside of those bounds, I need to speak to them with respect and an understanding that they have a central nervous system that won't be fully mature until age 25. How can I expect them to do
wow.
everything perfectly now? And so
Mm,
it isn't that they're trying to get you. American parents are well known to believe that your children are in this power struggle with you, and the only way to succeed is to tamp that down with force. They're not. They're just learning how to interact. And if they're doing something really crazy, like, who did they learn it from? As a parent, you
Mm,
have near complete control who they interact with. This is on you, it's not on them, right? So as a parent, we need to take ownership that that behavior that's being expressed is partly, in this case, say, my fault. And if I want it fixed, I've got to just, if I'm constantly yelling all the time when something doesn't go well, eventually my children are going to say, this is the way I'm supposed to respond, and they're going to do the same thing. And if you
mm,
want them to act calmly, you have to role model that behavior. So sovereignty isn't you get to do anything you want. There are bounds to what normal human behavior when we're interacting with people. There are bounds to what that is, and your children need to adhere to those, but they need to do it like they need to be led into that kindly and respectfully. Because let's face it, if someone is acting, an adult is acting really disrespectful in your home, you don't immediately go to hitting them. There's a talk. We want to
yeah.
calm things down. We want to de-escalate.
Mhm.
But parents just immediately hit their children sometimes. It's like, but you wouldn't do that to the adult. So treat them the same. Um, if you're just willing to try to treat them the same, you will start moving in the direction of personal sovereignty for your children, and it just changes the way you interact with them. And they can experience it. They know.
Mm. It's such a lovely note to end it on because it really it may not always be easy, and there's going to be times where it's
Yeah.
not quite clear what to do. But I think just as a guiding principle to, as you say, treat your children as though they have hopes, dreams, rights, wishes,
Mm.
just like any adult does, as you say, we'll go in the right direction. So thank you
Right.
so much. This has been gorgeous. It really has. It really has. Where can listeners find out more about you and your work?
Well, like I always say, I'm easy to find. ArthurHaines.com is the website, and of course, I'm on social media like Facebook, and the community here is Wilder Waters Community, which is on Instagram. So really easy to connect with, and love hearing from people. So anybody who has any questions, if I can help, I would love to.
Oh, thank you so much, Arthur. I so appreciate you and who you are in the world. Thank you.
And thanks for again, like I warned you, thank you for allowing me to have another opportunity to speak on this sort of ancestral child rearing, because it's something that I feel we really set children up for failure by leading them down a particular path that makes everything harder right from the beginning. And wouldn't it be nice if we could just raise children so that they don't have a lot of trauma that they need to figure out how to work through as adults? Like they just have this beautiful start to their existence. And this is one of the ways that we accomplish that.
Yeah. Oh, I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I very much hope you enjoyed watching that. And if you did and you're not already subscribed, then do hit that bell thingy and subscribe to automatically get each fresh new episode as it's released each week. If you'd like to find out more about the work we do at Be Mythical to guide and support old souls in this new world to live their own unique myth, do hop along to bemythical.com and you'll find out all the ways you can join us and go deeper with us on your own mythical journey. Lots of love for now. Mwah. See you again next week.